And normally high platelets are not necessarily a problem, but if they're really high, then you can actually become what's called hypercoagulable, which means that you're more prone to throwing clots. So you could actually potentially have an increased risk of a stroke. And it's not just a stroke to the brain, like you could have a stroke to the kidneys or other organs. And then low platelets are most commonly seen with bleeding and vasculitis, and then some immune-mediated conditions, certain drugs, some infections, certain cancers, certain splenic diseases, and then also bone marrow diseases. And low platelets are generally, they're not good, but until you hit about 75,000 platelets, right? So like on average, 150,000 is about normal. But once you hit 75,000, then you have to start worry about like bruising easily. And then when you're below 50,000, they can actually have spontaneous hemorrhage or bleeding. And that's when like they bump into stuff and they bleed a lot. And that becomes more of an emergency situation. But another thing to mention about platelets are cats, right? Because they're half alien, actually have microclotting. So they will form like platelet clumps after you draw their blood. So you draw their blood, you put it in the tube, right? And it's that purple top EDTA tube that is not supposed to clot. And what's interesting is that the presence of those we call it platelet clumping, because it's like cat platelets are a little more sticky. So even though they are in the presence of something that should prevent clotting, they are sticky enough that they start to kind of like stick together. And so on the automated count, the platelets can look low, and then you have to do what's called a platelet estimate. So you make a little blood smear, you stain it, you look at it under the microscope, and out in the edge, so we call it the feathered edge. So a blood smear usually looks like a thumbprint with like little feathers at the end, and at the feathered part, or the feathered edge, you'll see all these little clumps of platelets. And so it is an artificial thrombocytopenia because they likely have adequate numbers. It's just because of the clumping, it really negatively affects it. And if you're like me as a veterinarian and you get a result you don't like, then you usually say, well, you need to repeat it. Or you do a different test to prove whether or not it is actually correct. So any cat, if we run blood work in-house, that comes up with a thrombocytopenia, we always do a platelet estimate. And I've trained my staff very well. I've trained most of my assistants and technicians how to read platelet counts. And so if it comes up with a thrombocytopenia, they frequently just go ahead and at least make a blood smear. They don't always get time to read it, but then I'll say, we need to read a blood smear just to look at the platelets. We call it a platelet estimate. And then they'll say, cool, I already created one. And I'll say, good job, way to be amazing. So that kind of very long, not brief summary of just the CBCs shows you how important and how much information we can get just by looking at the red cells, white cells, and platelets. And then not next week, but the week after, we are going to look at the chemistry panel, which I will try really hard to make not like 1,000,000 hours long, because that's even more complicated and even more interesting. So we'll try and stick just to the facts, ma'am, just to kind of give you an idea of how we approach it and how valuable that information is. I am also in the middle of creating kind of it's going to be like 1,000 pages long, summary of everything that I'm talking about to give to clients that are really interested, or anybody that's interested in kind of reviewing this on paper. So if you want a copy of this once I'm done, you could just either call the clinic at Independent Hill or Montclair, because I'll be at both, or you can email info@independenthillvet.com or info@montclairanimalhospital.com. And I think that's enough cramming your brain full of information for this week, and we'll see you next week. I think that about wraps it up. As always, thank you for listening to this installment of Vetsplaining. I hope you enjoyed your time with me and ideally learned at least one new thing for the day. If you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, feel free to leave a comment below or email info@independenthillvet.com and put podcast topic or podcast comment in the subject line. Until next time.